Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with your hosts, Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You know, I don't know why I say welcome to the show every week, William. Because the intro always says, welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and
your crazy redneck host, William Hall.
So how's Memorial Day there in the U.S.?
You know, it was good. I was very delighted to have a surprise visit by two cousins from the same uncle, and neither one of them knew that they were coming. They just sort of both showed up at the doorstep, and they were like, "Hey, what are you doing here? Hey, what are you doing here?" It was really, and they're two cousins I haven't seen that's never come to visit me, but it's really, really wild. So it made for a really pleasant weekend in the U.S. here for the Memorial Day. Cool.
We celebrated Memorial Day a little bit ago here in Israel, and yesterday we actually observed Rosh Chodesh. It's Rosh Chodesh Sivan. We're getting ready in just a few days to celebrate the holy day of Shavuot, yes, which is Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai. So it's very exciting. It starts at sundown here Thursday, and Friday comes right into Shabbat. It's 2 days in what we call Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land. But I guess being that it's going to come into Shabbat for them, so it's kind of the same thing for them. They'll observe it just those 2 days and as they come out of Shabbat, it'll be over for them. So very excited about Shavuot. Shavuot is always a great time. It's not like we haven't already eaten way too much in lockdown the past few weeks, but everybody's getting ready to eat their cheesecake and all their dairy and learning Torah all night. So that's something that we always look forward to, is learning Torah all night here in Israel.
And I hear you make a mean cheesecake, from what I hear.
That's what they tell me. So I have all the ingredients sitting here ready to go, and it's just a matter of between Wednesday and Thursday getting ready to do that.
Yeah, my wife makes a mean cheesecake too. Y'all have to do a cook-off sometime.
Yeah, awesome. One of these days when they allow us to come back and travel again. Right. It looks like we're definitely not going to be able to come on this trip that we were planning in several weeks. Looks like Israel is not going to be opening up here to outbound flights until at least July. We were supposed to come this third week in June. We're going to have to go to a break, William, but when we come back, we'll be talking about Parsha Naso, which is coming up on Shabbat, the Shabbat after Shavuot. So stay with us. We're going to be right back here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Be biblical. Be beautiful. Wear your crown.
Wrapping is my crown.
Do what married Jewish women have been doing for thousands of years. Celebrate the art of head wrapping. I'm Andrea Grinberg from Rapunzel.com. We have beautiful scarves, stunning accessories, scarves for faith, scarves for healing, and scarves for fun. Rapunzel.com. That's Rapunzel with a W. Or click on our banner on the Israel News Talk Radio homepage.
Rapunzel.com. Beautiful scarves, stunning accessories paired with tutorials, support, and a vibrant community to give you everything you need to start and perfect your head covering journey.
Don't forget, join the Rapunzel community group on Facebook to see, learn, and share your beautiful wraps. That's Rapunzel with a W on Facebook.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
I love Rapunzel.
Get 10% off your purchase with promo code RADIO. Go now to Rapunzel.com.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah here on Israel News Talk Radio. So today we're going to be discussing in this segment 2, we're going to be discussing Parshat Naso, and as you mentioned earlier, which discusses what I thought was just a tractate, but also Sotah, which is actually translated to the adulterous woman, I guess.
Yeah, it's the woman who's suspected of adultery by her husband.
Gotcha. Okay, very good, very good. I've always been fascinated by this whole Parsha, and even the commentary on it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting ritual, and I always find it interesting that Naso is one of those parshiot. Again, we always talk about these things that some people will open up and they'll look at them and kind of think to themselves, all right, what's interesting about this, when it starts giving you lineage, or it starts telling you about the different Levites, the different groups of Levites and what they're responsible for the Mishkan. And it starts giving you numbers, like there's this many from this tribe and this many from this tribe. And then it came out to this many thousands of men. And then you have also in Naso, where each one of the heads of the tribes brings the same offering for the Mishkan, where they bring a bowl that's 130 shekel of silver weight. They bring a certain number of bulls, and each one of them bringing the same offering day by day by day. And people look at some of these things and they think to themselves, how is that relevant? And then they look at something like the Sotah, like the adulterous woman, and think to themselves, why is this in there? And then you have right after the Sotah, this ritual of the one who's suspected of adultery. Then you have the Nazir, or what we call the Nazirite in English, the person who makes the vow to not drink wine or eat grapes and so forth. So I always find those things interesting. And I always try to see if there's something that we can glean more from it. And certainly there's some very interesting things related to this Torah portion that we see in the Zohar. Before I say that, I just wanted to mention that one of the things that you and I have been talking about for quite some time, whenever you're talking about the Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan, we've talked about this idea of preparation. And here we are in the midst of the counting of the Omer, that we start counting on the day after Passover. We have this 49-day count where we're counting the Omer every night until we get to the holiday of Shavuot. And one of the things we always talk about is this idea of preparing ourselves. Of course, Bnei Israel, the Hebrew slaves that have been basically taken out of Egypt by Hashem, were now also told to prepare themselves to receive the Torah. But it's very interesting because we're sort of at the beginning of this new book of Bamidbar in the wilderness, towards the end of Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 46, after Hashem has given them all of these laws, all of these instructions, it actually says in verse 46 in the Hebrew, it says, Ela hachukim v'hamishpatim v'hatorah asher natan Hashem beno uvein bnei Israel b'har Sinai b'yad Moshe. And I'm sorry, what I said was hachukim v'hamishpatim, but it doesn't say v'hatorah, it says v'hatorot. It has Torot in plural. And so the first thing we learn from that is that after Hashem, after God has given all these instructions, he then specifically uses the plural Torot. After saying chukim and mishpatim, after he says these, my chukim, my judgments and so forth, then he says my two Torot, the plural Torot, meaning the idea of giving both the written Torah and the oral Torah on Har Sinai.
Now, to play the devil's advocate here, one could say, and argue, because I hear a lot of it, not just from ex-Christians and even Christians, but also from people who were maybe Jews or secular Jews or whatever the case may be, and they say, well, chukim and mishpatim are also plural, so it seems like it would make more sense to them if it said, the mishpat and chukat instead of mishpatim and chukim, right? So,
right. So think about that for a minute, or what you just said, and realize why what they're saying doesn't make sense. Because
I've always heard that there's three types of three different types of things. You got the laws, ordinances, and the judgments. And those are all three separate classifications of items that are in the Torah.
That's very true. But we've also seen times where the words will just be, these are my instructions, or these are my laws. And we don't see it specifically mapped out separately as chukim, mishpatim, and torot.
Okay.
We don't see it in that way. So the idea that we have the plural Torot next to the plural of chukim and mishpatim doesn't really mean anything. What it shows us is that he's making a separation between this, that he's saying, yes, there are all these regulations, and yes, there are all these instructions, but guess what? There are also Torot, meaning, implying more than just this idea of laws. It actually has a very strong implication of this idea of both the oral Torah and the written Torah being given at Har Sinai. And I know that typically Christians and ex-Christians, many of them have a problem with that, and many of them, for instance, will go towards what we call a Tanakh only kind of observance or Karaite. And by the way, just to clear that up, I've also heard people that still believe in Jesus call themselves Karaites. Ones that lean more towards what you would call Hebrew roots, or what I call Hebrew Christianity, where they've said, "Oh, I'm a Karaite," and I would tell you that Karaites would reject that, because even Karaites, as much as we in Orthodox Judaism don't accept the idea of Karaism, the idea of a rejection of the oral Torah, there's no way you can believe in Jesus as God or Jesus as Messiah and call yourself a Karaite. So the Karaites would even reject that notion. The interesting thing about that is that the Karaites, anybody who really does a deep study of the Karaites will learn that the Karaites have their own oral traditions as well. You can't have an observance, you can't have a belief in Hashem and not have some kind of oral tradition. So while they may reject what they consider rabbinic Judaism and reject the idea of the Talmud, they have their own oral tradition. They can't deny that. So everybody does.
The Christians have theirs as well. It's called the Strong's Concordance.
Really? And you know what's funny about that? I know we wanted to talk about Sotah and Shavuot and some of those things and this idea of preparation. I always think that's funny because the Strong's Concordance has to be the worst translation of Hebrew. I think it makes it easy for people because they have a whole numbering system where people can go and look at the number and then look it up and say, oh, it means that. Honestly, don't even think their Greek is so accurate either, related to the New Testament. But speaking of which, I was thinking about you because Rav Gedalia Flair, who I learn with, and he handed me a book over Shabbat. I was there for Shabbat, and we somehow got on the subject about Christianity because he knows that the radio show that I do and the type of work that I do. And so he gave me this book called The Myth Maker, Paul, the inventor of Christianity. And I've never seen the book before, and it's actually an amazing read. I just got it on Friday night. I got home very late, and I'm already halfway through the book.
Wow.
And this guy makes the argument that you can discount based on the New Testament itself and Paul's testimony itself and some of the other things that you read in Acts, you can clearly show that there's no way that Paul was a Pharisee. He even goes so far as to believe that Paul was probably born into a Gentile family and converted to Judaism later in life.
Wow.
Or his parents converted and then he converted, and that there is no way that that his whole idea of being a Pharisee, which kind of made me laugh because when we're talking about the whole Hebrew roots and Messianic and Hebrew Christianity and so forth, one of the things that we see all the time, and this is one of the things I was talking to Rav Gedalia about, was the idea that people will kind of inflate their lineage. They'll say, oh, I grew up Orthodox. And then when you test them, you can see clearly they've never learned anything. They barely know, clearly can't read Hebrew. And it made me think about that when I was reading this book about Paul. He believes that Paul also inflated his lineage and tried to make it appear like he was a Pharisee in order to get people to accept and believe what he was saying. And yet he comes against and speaks against people who were actually with Jesus. That here you have Peter and James, his brother, who took over the Jerusalem church, and they were with him. And yet here you have this guy, Paul, who just claims to have had an experience on the road to Damascus, and he's the one who basically most Christians follow today.
Right. And it's still going on today. I mean, one thing I've seen a lot of since I've been doing my own testimonials on the show is somebody sent me a video about 4 years ago of this guy named Montel Ballaston, who's supposed to be an Orthodox Jew. But as it turns out, he wasn't an Orthodox Jew. In fact, he was raised as a secular Jew and didn't even study the Bible. His first leap into anything biblically related was into the Christian New Testament, and where he ridiculed the Jewish faith altogether, sitting in that chair as a Jew, and it was disgusting.
Yeah, I've seen him, and it's kind of like Michael Brown, who blocked me. Michael Brown is the same thing. I mean, here's a guy who grew up a secular Jew that knew nothing about Yiddishkeit at all, had an experience after being into drugs and alcohol and so forth at the age of 16 or something like that, and then came to faith in Jesus. So he never really had any kind of Jewish background at all. Anyway, maybe in round two, when we get to the second segment here, after we come back from the break, maybe we'll talk about a little bit more about Sotah and Parsha Naso. So stay with us. We'll be right back here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
The Tamar Yonah Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yonah. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yonah Show.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Science of Kabbalah. This is Rabbi Yitzchak, along with the amazing
William Hall.
William so amazing. Hall. Before the break and before the last segment, we were talking about Sotah, we were talking about preparation, we were talking about Shavuot, and we were talking about the idea of the oral and the written Torah. And I was saying that sometimes people see these things and they don't connect with them, or they see these lineages and they see something like the Sotah and they go, oh, that's so degrading. And to try and see if there are sort of important lessons that we can learn from stories or rituals or laws that we see in the Torah that a person might think doesn't apply to them. And that's why I wanted to talk about this idea of the Sotah a little bit. And it's interesting because in a way, we can trace this back all the way to the sin of Adam and Chava in Gan Eden, in the garden, when they ate from the Eitz Hadat, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One of the opinions is pomegranate, but usually the most popular are that it was either an olive tree. The Talmud talks quite a bit about, a lot of the rabbis think it was actually wheat. And then there is another opinion that it was a grapevine. The grapevine makes a lot of sense and is significant in what we're talking about, because I mentioned to you, I don't know if I mentioned on here, because you and I talk a lot before we get on the air. We were talking off the air about the Nazir and how there's the juxtaposition of the Nazir or the Nazirite that comes right after the Sotah. So I think that that's interesting. Right. What's the connection? So there are those that believe that the reason why Nazir comes to us right after this woman that's suspected of adultery is to teach you that anyone who sees her, who sees the Sotah in her disgrace, will then vow to abstain from wine, as does this person who's the Nazir, who takes the vow. This sort of gives us sort of an educational message as to the seriousness, because many times when you read about the prohibited sexual relationships. And we talked about that probably about a month or so ago on the show, about all of these different prohibited sexual relationships that the Torah tells about. We certainly read about that in Vayikra. We often see, and we even know today, that the idea of consuming alcohol is something that lowers people's inhibitions and certainly puts them in a position. It doesn't take much to look at the modern day. Certainly, this can happen in any community. We see it certainly much more in secular communities than we do in religious. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen in the religious community, but certainly you see that typically when people enter into an adulterous relationship, it's because they ended up somewhere at a bar and they started drinking, or, guys go to a strip club or something like that, and they get themselves caught up into things that they can't get out of. And so this is why I think it's important to notice that this Nazir comes right after the Sotah to teach us this idea that we should be very careful about this. We see sort of a couple of stories in the Tanakh that kind of allude to this, just to kind of make the point even stronger about this. We certainly see this in the idea of Noach, in Parsha Noach, or Noah, when he drinks and gets inebriated. And there are different opinions about what happened with his son, with the one son, that he did take liberties sexually with his father. That is an opinion that is brought by the sages of Judaism, as much as people don't like to think about that. We have the situation of Lot, the nephew of Avraham Avinu, and his daughters. And we have warnings from the Nevi'im, from the prophets, about wine. We see in the book of Hosea in chapter 4, verse 11, where it basically says that prostitution and wine and new wine take away the heart. So we have allusions to this in the Tanakh about this idea of kind of staying away from drinking excessively and having wine. And that's why I think it's important to bring that up here.
Okay.
And when we're talking about that, then we have the issue of thinking about, when we're talking about this idea of preparing ourselves through the counting of the Omer and preparing ourselves for receiving the Torah, once again this week on Shavuot, we have to think about what we do related to following our own desires. So I was thinking about this as well, because you could talk about this related to other things besides alcohol. So I'm sure, William, being a Texas guy, that at some point in your life you've gone camping.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, of course. And I was a Boy Scout, so I certainly did when I was growing up. Do you ever remember leaving food out when you were camping?
Only once.
Only once. Yeah, that happens only once.
Kind of learned a lesson pretty hard.
Yeah, you learn a lesson pretty hard, because it doesn't matter if you're out camping or even if you're out, let's say, having a picnic or whatever, and you're in any place where there's potentially either domesticated animals or wild animals. Eventually, those animals are going to stick their nose in the picnic basket. Hey, boo-boo.
That was pretty good, by the way.
My boo-boo, smarter than the average bear. Picnic basket. So anyway, anybody knows that, like if you're out in the woods, there are situations where bears are out there, and if you don't tie up your food, they're going to get to it. Or, when I say domesticated, there might be goats or cows or whatever. They're going to be nosy. Inevitably, they're going to be popping their head into your food or into their basket. But you could say to yourself, how can that animal do that when the food is not his? Mm-hmm. And then the answer is that when an animal sees food or smells food, it wants the food and it wants to eat the food. It doesn't ask any questions, because that's the nature of animals. Their passions and their instincts are the things that control them. So on a very basic level, we as human beings have to know that not everything is ours to take. We don't get to stick our noses in the picnic basket or go after other people's foods. So then you could make the argument past this idea of alcohol that we get into the idea of kashrut, or when we talk about kosher food. A person can't just take food that looks appealing if the food doesn't belong to him. And that's the difference that separates man from animal. And yet, we know from a Kabbalistic standpoint that we have both of these things operating in us. We have both an upper elevated soul and we have an animalistic nature that sees the food, smells the food, and wants the food. You could say, I know that I'm hungry and I would like that food very much, but I can't take it because it's not mine. And as Jews, we have many more restrictions related to kashrut. Now, I would say, and there are people that might argue with me, but I think very clearly if you're a person who follows the Torah and you want to connect with Hashem, that he clearly says what is food and what is not, and what is not food. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that a person who's not Jewish has to keep the same kind of restrictions as it relates to kashrut and the idea of eating, certain higher levels of kashrut and so forth. But I think it's a non-issue for that person, whether they identify as B'nai Noach or they're in the process of conversion or however you want to identify yourselves. If you've given up idolatry and you want to attach yourself to Torah and to Hashem, then there are certain things you shouldn't eat. Okay, so you may shop in a regular supermarket, not in at a kosher supermarket that has a higher level of kashrut. But I don't think the person I'm talking about should be eating pork or should be eating shellfish and eating bugs of the sea and so forth. I think clearly Hashem separated out and told you what is food and what is not food.
Right.
So I think we as human beings, that we have to have an awareness that there are certain things that are morally off limits. And this is what defines us as being made in the image of God.
Well, I think when we resort back to our animal nature, meaning just, taking those things that we just want, even if it's not illegal, to the law, and if it's something that you can do and get away with, it's still, the whole idea of acting based on instinct or versus, processing the information and making good moral choices. So the idea of sin is literally acting like an animal.
Oh, there's no question. And so when we go back, based on what you're saying, and we think about what I said about this tracing back to the Garden of Eden, and when the first man, Adam, ate from the tree of the Eitz Hadat, of the tree of knowledge, what he basically did was, remember, we're talking about being created in the image of God, and I've said that when we talk about that, it uses Adam, that word Adam, which relates to all of humanity and not just Jewish people. So when we're talking about this idea of being created in the image of God, basically what we're saying is that Adam, basically by eating from that tree, eating of that fruit, he diminished his image of Hashem that was in him because Hashem told him, do not eat. We're going to have to go to a break here, William, but when we come back, I want to see if we can make a connection between this idea of Adam diminishing himself and the Sotah that we've been talking about, this woman who's been suspected of adultery. So stay with us. We're going to be right back here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah. where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
So we're in the final segment here on the Science of Kabbalah, and William had to run, so you've got me for this last segment alone. Before the break, I had brought up how we could trace back the idea of the Sotah and the Nazir back to Gan Eden, to Adam and Chava, and the sin of eating from the Eitz HaDa'at, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we were talking about our animalistic nature and our elevated soul and how we are created in the image of God, that all people are created in the image of God. And that by eating from the tree, that basically what Adam had done was diminished his image because he was told by Hashem, do not eat. But then we see the Nachash, the snake, came and said, but wait a minute. Everything looks so enticing and everything looks so good. It's like we talked about that picnic basket or that food being left out where the animal can't control himself. And so the snake convinced Adam and Chava, and basically they were controlled by their passions. We talked about the grapes, that eating those grapes, they diminished what's called the Tselem Elokim when we're talking about being created in the image. And so can we see if there's a connection to this Sotah, the Sotah being the woman who's suspected of adultery by her husband, who's basically given into her passions and in effect has lost the ability to say no. Now, I know a lot of people don't like to hear that kind of thing related to the Sotah because they wonder about it, and we're going to get to that hopefully in a few minutes. But when we look at this whole ritual of the Sotah, it's so different than any other laws that we see, any other Jewish law, because it basically has to do with, in a sense, humiliating the woman. When you think about it, she's brought before this Jewish court. She's brought before the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest. And basically what ends up happening is that she has this, her hair covering ripped off. Her hair is purposely messed up. Her clothing are sort of tattered and made to hang on her. And basically, she's publicly humiliated. And there really is a message that we can see from this. Because normally it's not typical within Judaism. It's not human nature to really usually humiliate people. And why do we say that? And specifically in Judaism, why? Because we just said that there's the Tselem Elokim, that each one of us is created in the image of God. But when we said that Adam, by eating from that fruit, had diminished his image, that Tselem Elokim, this is what we're saying as well, that potentially this woman that's suspected has also diminished her image. She has brought this basically on herself, and she has humiliated herself. The Beit Din is just bringing out into the open the humiliation that she has already brought upon herself in private. Now, people will say, well, wait a minute. She's just suspected of this crime, but it hasn't been proven. And when she goes through this whole ritual, there is the potential for her to be not guilty, to be innocent in a way. But we have to remember that even if, in fact, she did not commit adultery, it's believed that she would be at least be guilty of secluding herself, what we call yichud, with another man and violating her husband's specific warning not to allow herself to be in private with another individual, with another man. This is something that we see even in the Jewish wedding. After a couple goes to the chuppah, after they go to the wedding canopy, after the ceremony, they then go to a room where they go to yichud. They go into seclusion. I had a friend that got married in the last year, and I was a witness at his wedding. We call that being an aid, a witness. And as a witness, I was then also asked to go and stand outside the door of the yichud room, of that room where they secluded themselves. This is the only time that a man should be alone with a woman, and that woman should be his wife. In the same way, a woman that is married should only be in yichud, in seclusion with her husband, not with any other man. So that's when we see this, when we say to ourselves, well, maybe she was innocent, there is still that idea of the breaking of the yichud. In the Kabbalah, which holds that, talking about deity, when we're talking about Hashem, that Hashem is revealed in the structure of the 10 sefirot, of the 10 emanations or the 10 attributes. And so this idea of obeying the Torah and its commandments is not a human trait, it's actually a divine one. The human activity is not confined to the horizontal, but it soars vertically towards the divine. We reach up towards Hashem. This is what we're supposed to do, and this is the reason for sacred worship according to the Kabbalistic Sefirot, that there's devotion is a need of the elevated soul that we have. And so the sacred bond between a man and his wife is also seen in the Kabbalah also as a divine need. According to the Kabbalah, a woman who betrays her husband undermines the very throne of Hashem and causes devastating harm to the holy union of the two sides of the divine. When we looked at the upper sefirot, we know that we have Keter, we have crown, and then below that is Chokhmah and Binah. Chokhmah is considered Abba, father. Binah is considered Ima, mother. And Chokhmah and Binah together are the two sides of the divine. So basically, when we have a sacred bond between man and his wife broken, and we see that it causes harm to the holy union of the two sides of the divine, basically breaking the harmonious union between the male side of the Sefirot and the female side of the Sefirot, that ends up causing damage to all the worlds and bringing in evil into the world. The union of man and his wife is also related to the union of Hashem and the two sides. Often we talk about the right side and the left side, Chesed and Gevurah. We talk about the idea of the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the tetragrammaton related to Chesed, and the idea of Elohim, one of the other names of God related to the left side of Gevurah, which is related to might, strength, or judgment. And so we see all of these connections. But if, God forbid, the woman that's wayward regarding her husband, basically what ends up happening is there's a harm to that divine union. And so this divine wisdom commanded the priest, a man of mercy, of Chesed, the high priest, who is the one who is supposed to repel all external uncleanness. He's the one that investigates the matter through the power of Hashem, because this ritual is not something that's man-made. It's actually probably one of the only rituals that we see. While we see punishments, other rituals with punishments, it's the only one that really has a supernatural component to it, where the real judge, the real one who is standing in judgment of this person, is not the high priest only acting as an agent or representative of Hashem, but really it is Hashem himself who stands. So the role of the priest in this ritual which represents the sphera, the side of the divine grace that we talk about, the side of chesed, is really meant to restore harmony to the human couple, and likewise to that divine union, to the upper union that we're talking about. And the final objective of the Sotah ritual is to bring about that union, to separate defilement from purity in the divine world, and then restore unity between all of the sferot to its original pristine state, without any kind of klipa, with any kind of shell, without any kind of evil brought in to the situation. In other words, the whole ritual of the Sotah in the Tanakh, in the Torah, in the Bible, is interpreted by the Kabbalah as a ritual aimed at correcting the Shekhinah, the very divine presence of Hashem. There's so much spoken about this in the writings of the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria of blessed memory, and the juxtaposition of the Nazir that we talked about. So it's so important as we're preparing ourselves in the next few days for Shavuot, preparing ourselves to once again to receive the Holy Torah from Hashem as we did at Har Sinai. We need to be a people that cleanse ourselves. We need to be a people that prepare ourselves. We need to recognize this very ritual that we read about in the Torah, but it has to do with the same way that Hashem tested Bnei Yisrael at the bitter waters, where the tree that was thrown into the water that sweetened it was related to the same ritual where the name of Hashem is written down and then put into the water that the Sotah drinks. That Hashem needed to test us in order to see whether or not we were worthy to have the divine name placed on us. So let us remember this as we move forward in the next few days, to remember to be a people that prepare ourselves, cleanse ourselves, and prepare to receive the Torah again. Thank you for listening. Stay with us every week here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.